Thank you. That was a blast from the past for everyone.
It did. I know that you asked me to describe it as, one of the roughest Pennebaker Hegedus films you ever see, but I think the restoration is really making it look as good as I've ever seen it.
Oh, well, thank you, Criterion.
So, Jim, you were there that night, and as I described the introduction, I remember Pennebaker telling me that the filming conditions were run and gun. Do you have any memories of that night to shed light on that?
Fun and gotten.
No, I said run and gun. I described that the Pennebaker had said that there was a crew that was running town hall that didn't really want cameras there.
Oh yeah, no, nobody was quite up to it. I don't think they were all having a lot of fun. Just closer to your mouth. Closer? Oh yes. Hello. It's a long time ago, and Norman had just sort of come into our view with working with us on film, and I think they were all sort of stretching their muscles to see who would come up with something that was something they could all bite into, and Norman was what they were trying to bite into. I think a lot of it, because he was ready to scuffle all the time, and so were all the women. It was a real. I said I didn't. It was intellectual, but it was sexual. It was all sorts of. They were having a wonderful time, is what I thought was going on, and it was disorganized, and topic sentences were fought about. It was a strange attempt at confrontation that I think most of them were sort of intellectual friends that they'd played around with for years with this little boxing match that they had, and nothing much came of it. There were some wonderful people there who I didn't see in there. Cynthia Ozick was somebody who really put the screws to Norman and gave him. She was very. It was. She was
in the audience. You mean that night?
Yeah, she was in the audience, and it was a little sparring match that I guess we were on the sort of first opening parts of that intellectual stuff that's been going on ever since, where they were boxing a little bit, and I don't know, Chris, what do you think?
So, Chris, I gave a kind of summary in my introduction that when you came into Pennebaker's office, this was one of the first projects that you got your hands on. Can you elaborate on that?
When I first started working with Pennebaker, he had a whole wall of films that he had shot and not edited, and
still does, right?
Some of them are still there waiting.
They're still there, yeah, right.
Yeah, and we did a couple projects before. One was a project on Robert Kennedy going around to schools singing Jingle Bells with students when he was just beginning to run for the Senate. And then, he pulled out this one. And, it was particularly interesting for me because all of these women were my heroes, and I wasn't living in New York at the time of this event and didn't go to it. And, it just seemed incredible to me. It had so much sexual energy going on as well as anything else between Norman and Germaine. And just, the conversation was really so passionate and emotional. They were talking about issues that were very important to them all, whether they be, about the relations between men and women, or whether you should have a vaginal orgasm. It was quite an incredible evening, and it was very rough, is what I wanted to say. I don't know what Jim and you and Penny were thinking. It was like you were filming a rock concert on acid or something.
Right.
Your cameras were all over the place, but
there was tension. There was a sexual tension in the air.
it was driving you
I'd
guys
say
crazy. I can see that.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was a very long evening. I think it was about 2.5 hours, and I had to edit it down to a reasonable length. And also, a lot of it wasn't covered because I don't know, Jim, if you were shooting with 10-minute reel or you had one that was going for a longer length.
No, we all had little 10-minute reels.
So that's what I kind of remember from back then when I edited. So it would go for 10 minutes, and then they would run out, and there would always be parts missing to try to make a whole story from it. And for me, editing it, it was particularly daunting to edit, Germaine and Diana Trilling and Germaine's speeches and try to get the essence of what they were trying to talk about. But what I remember really most of all was after we made the film, and I think I started editing this in 1976, but we didn't put it out right away. And then, we invited the different people to come. And I remember when Norman came to our office to see it, he walked in and he said, "Well, that was the night that Jill Johnston turned my hair gray." And then he proceeded to say, I was totally clueless. I knew nothing about the women's movement, and, I was outrageous and combative and, as horrible as you could ever think. He was entirely gracious coming to the office after his behavior in the film, which, he's provocateur, he's a devil's advocate. And then Germaine came with a whole posse of her friends, and she kind of swept into the office, and I showed her the film, and they all loved Germaine. And then Jill came to see it when it premiered, and it premiered at the Whitney Museum. And she sat next to me, and she said, "I was the best thing that night, wasn't I?" And then she watched it up until she gave her speech, and then she just left, just like she left in the thing.
She'd seen the best, why wait for the rest, right?
Yeah.
I should acknowledge that Jim, your wife, Kathy Desmond, was one of the sound recordists in the film.
Yes, we had just been dating for a short time, I think. I'm not sure about the time, but and I told her.
So there was sexual tension in the room.
Well, yeah, there was a lot of tension in the room because everybody was trying to get their footing on this concept that everybody had been sort of talking around with their groups of friends, but this was laid out in public, and people weren't quite sure whether to be firm in their statements or playing a little bit. There was a lot of playing to me in that stuff. But my wife, I said she was not a filmmaker at the time, and still isn't. But anyway, she said, I told her, "You're taking sound for me, but you have to be very cautious. That machine that you've got there, that Nagra tape recorder, is very important. So if anything happens, you protect the Nagra." And she said, "Okay, yeah, all right." So, and Jill Johnston came. Her lover was on the stage, and she decided to come up over my wife's back, and Kath was protecting the Nagra, and she just climbed right up on Jill's back and got on stage and hugged her boyfriend, her girlfriend, and that was I think Kath's entry into real documentary filmmaking. And but it was a sort of a funny free for all with ideas floating around in the air that all these women had been talking about very for a long time, and and had some real form to it. So what I felt was they were trying to get Norman into the concept of we could make something out of this. This is very interesting on stage, talking to people about this concept, and it could work into a little thing we do. Have a little fun on stage, and a little sexual tension.
All right, let me take some questions from the audience. That's a good question. Did the experience of these ideas make you and Pennebaker feel more feminist? And I'll ask Chris a version of that.
Well, to me, it always makes a man sound slightly foolish, because the women have had much more thought about this idea, and men just seem to have sort of plowed through life doing their manly thing, and they get tripped up by people who had been thinking about this. And I think that's what it seemed like the guys were smart and the women were a little bit smarter.
So, Chris, Pennebaker was from a generation when the workforce was mainly male, and yet he did have experiences in the early 60s, partnered with Hope Ryden at Drew Associates. They made a few films together. You had a multi-decade career. What do you think his evolution on feminism was?
I think it's kind of what Jim was saying. I think, Penny didn't edit the film because he didn't want to make a film that was at the expense, humorously, of women. And he wanted to deal with this, the humor that was there, but to try to deal with the matters that were very serious. Because, what's interesting about this event is that they're talking about things that are very serious to them, and were very serious to women, too. It was a time when, women couldn't even get a credit card unless they were married. There were, serious inequality between men and women in the workplace, at home, in the bed, all over. And I think, he wanted to make sure that the film wasn't something that was just, laughing at an evening, that had a lot of humor to it, but also had serious stuff going on. Because Norman is continually funny in the film, the things he does, and the the lines that he comes out with, and little things he does, like he goes over and pours water for all the women, and does things like that. But I think Penny has always respected working with women, and throughout our career, and I appreciate that.
All right, let's take another question. Well, if I don't see another question, Chris, let me ask you about the work that you have in progress for restoration. My understanding is Criterion is working on a few titles. We showed Company in February, and I think they're working on that one and this one. Can you shed light on other projects?
Yes, they're hoping to put out a set of films about theater, about Broadway theater. So it would be Company, another film we did called Moon Over Broadway, and a very early film of Penny's called Jane, which was on Jane Fonda's Broadway debut, which was very influential for me to get into filmmaking. And, as many as we can interest them in, which, we have a lot of, and they all need to be restored in some way or another. So it's a big project, and it's a difficult project because 4K and 16 millimeter grain are not that happy together. So it's a struggle. But Criterion is an amazing company, and I have a lot of material on Town Bloody Hall in terms of other outtakes, but also Germaine did a commentary for me years ago, which was really interesting, and we have some interviews with Norman as well. as Jill Johnston, and there was an anniversary of this town hall event back in 2001, and we filmed some of that too. And it was kind of interesting because a lot of the women still wanted to kind of ostracize Jill at the event in a certain way because they thought she would make trouble.
In
And,
2001, it was the same group of women?
Well, yeah, because they invited a lot of the people who were still around to come to the event, and I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. But Jill thought of it as a real coup to have been invited, past 14th Street to kind of go in the enemy camp and talk to everybody, and tell them they all should be lesbians basically. And she said there were a couple other things that she wanted to do. Like one of her ideas was to get all these water balloons and hang them in a net above the audience, and then at a particular time kind of let them come crashing down. I mean, she had all sorts of kind of great ideas in it. But
So all these outtakes and extras that you're describing, will we get to see them with the new package?
I don't know. I mean, we're just figuring it out.
You're figuring it
now.
out,
Yeah.
Yes, well, when you said that it was 2.5 hours that you whittled down to this 90 minutes, I immediately started wondering about that extra hour.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's so much stuff that was caught in the extra hour just because of the nature
You
of
did a good
filming
job
that
with the
10-minute
edit.
roll. But there could be some stuff backstage that I'd like to try to see if I can find.
All right, I have time for one more question if someone's got one. And if you don't, we can, at the very back, yep. So after working on this one, what was your next project?
Okay, so before we actually put this out as a film, after this, the big project that we did was a film called The Energy War, which was a 5-hour series for PBS about Jimmy Carter's energy bill, which ended up being the longest filibuster ever in Congress, type with amendments that was outlawed after a while to do. And it was a battle that pretty much cost him his presidency in a certain way, besides other political things that happened in Iran and other places. But
And that 5-part series, The Energy War, is so fascinating for its time in 1979 because we think of today as being a boom time for documentary series. Well, this was, long before that as a real predecessor. And it's so fascinating to watch that project and realize how many of the ideas being discussed then about the future of energy are still with us now, 40 years later.
yeah, I mean, it really covers all sides of the issue. So it was James Schlesinger, who was Secretary of Energy, and Carter, and reporters, and swing voters, and senators. But what was interesting about it in today's world is it was probably one of the last moments where people reached across the aisle and had conversations with each other and tried to compromise. And there's certain senators like Jackson and others who were famous for doing that at that point. And so, like all of these films, they're the history of our times.
Maybe in a future Doc NYC we can do a whole night of Energy War. Maybe not the whole 5 hours, but some sections. Certainly we'll have a lot more of attention to pay to the incredible Pennebaker Hegedus collection in the years to come. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks especially to Jim Desmond and Chris Hegedus.
Thank you all.
What was the year of this that we shot this?
71.
71. Just put it in context. Monterey Pop was 67. So to put this in the worldwide context of that music that was going on now and the energy that was building in the United States and all over the world, that a new little element had come in. The rock and roll had really started taking over. Lots of thought, even though there wasn't a lot of thought sometimes in it. But it's also nice to put all those things where they fit in what's going on with the people with questions about what's going on the planet. It's one of them.
Thank you very much for being
Thank
here,
you.
Jim.